Hello and welcome to this second part on worship. And in this episode, I just want to bring an introduction on how to get into God's presence. Now, I think we would all agree that the point of the singing of songs on Sunday morning is to get into God's special presence. But how many people, I wonder, know how to get into God's presence? If you didn't know, there are in the Bible instructions on how to get into God's presence. But what I've got here isn't just applicable to the singing of songs, but to prayer also. And as I get older, I see a more and more blurred line between prayer and the singing of so-called worship songs. Now, one place that details this process of getting into God's presence is in Psalm 100. Verse 4, enter into his gates with thanksgiving and into his courts with praise. Now, thanksgiving in the Bible generally addresses God's goodness, for example, in his provision. Praise in the Bible generally addresses God's greatness, for example, how he far exceeds us. Now, the first 7 verses of Psalm 95 expands on this idea. Verse 1, O come, let us sing to the Lord, let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Now, the shout joyfully means to make an ear-splittingly loud noise. God likes our singing to such an extent that he even asks for it. And this and other verses makes me so aware that there is a special power in singing. Not only that, but shout joyfully, a not very British thing there, but perhaps not very musical either. But it does talk of unreserved passion for God. Verse 2, let us come before his presence with thanksgiving. Let us shout joyfully to him with psalms. Now, the word psalms means praises. So we start with thanksgiving and then move on to praise. And remember, praise addresses the greatness of God, and hence the next verse. Verse 3, for the Lord is the great God and the great King above all gods. Now, the next 2 verses give examples of his greatness that we are praising. Verse 4, in his hand are the deep places of the earth, the heights of the hills are his also. And this is a wonderfully poetic way of saying that everything in and on the earth are in his hands. Moving on to verse 5, the sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. But then the psalmist comes to what the point is of thankfulness and praise, so we can worship the Lord. Verse 6, O come, let us worship and bow down, let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. Now, the bow down here is more accurately bend the knee, an old-fashioned expression that means to kneel physically. In the second half of the verse, kneel does mean to kneel, but in a way of blessing and expressing adoration. So a part of our worship should be expressing our adoration for God, our love for him. And finally, verse 7, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. So there's some simple declarations there. Now, the Bible does have an example of a practical application of this process. If we read the part of the Bible that deals with the consecration of the temple by Solomon, we can see the progression from thanksgiving and praise to worship and adoration in 2 Chronicles chapters 5, 6 and 7, and these are interspersed with prayer. Now Solomon and the congregation are clearly on a journey in this episode from normality to a tangible presence of God. And what I mean by that is it can be detected by our physical senses. The tangibleness was evidenced by a cloud and fire from heaven. So there we have a process of getting into God's presence as directed by God himself, through thanksgiving and praise into worship. Now the next few sessions will look a bit deeper into these ideas of thanksgiving and praise and worship. Thank you and goodbye.